Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast, and today my guest is Dr. Dixie Dillon Lane. She is an associate editor at Hearth&Field and contributing editor at Front Porch Republic and author of the forthcoming book, Skipping School. Well, thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me, Dean. I'm really happy to speak with you.
As I say to basically everyone on this program, we know one another through Twitter. Mm-hmm. How is Twitter going for you lately?
Oh, well, Twitter is the only social media I'm on, unless you count Substack. Mm-hmm. And the reason I'm on it is that it's really so wonderful for meeting people who can become colleagues or counterparts. So for meeting editors, for discussing with people who are thinking about important things. So I really enjoy it for that. I think it's become a little bit harder lately because links have been, the links get less attention because of algorithm. But especially when I first joined a couple years ago, it was wonderful for sharing ideas and stories. So that's what I like about it.
People nice to you there?
Mostly. When they're not, I try not to take the bait. I don't think I'm controversial, but it turns out that homeschooling, which is one of the topics I write about as a historian, really upsets some people. So
tell me, what did you say that upset them?
Some people see homeschooling as abusive, full stop, which I don't think is either backed up by research or is a very thoughtful way of seeing it. I think people get alarmed about it sometimes, and I have my ideas about why, but sometimes I will post something about homeschooling and talking about the benefits that it has for children. And I never suggest that it's something everyone should do or that it's the only good way to get an education. But every once in a while, there's someone who thinks it's immoral to say anything good about homeschooling, and they'll jump on me. But like I said, that doesn't happen very often.
And what do you think their reasons are? You said, I think I know their reasons.
Well, I don't know anyone's motivation for anything.
If you were going to cast some aspersions, what would they be?
If I were going to cast aspersions, well, I don't think it's casting aspersions. I think people are genuinely concerned for children, but I think that part of the alarm about homeschooling is the fantasy we have in our minds that public schools are giving most children an adequate academic education. And while some are, and some are doing very well, all you have to do is look at the federal government or the state's own research data to see that the majority of children are not at proficiency level in reading or in math, which was actually quite shocking to me when I started my research. I figured probably most were, but actually most are not. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we attack homeschooling, we are in our minds saying it's not safe to homeschool because they are being removed from the adequate education they could get at the public school. So in some ways, as long as homeschooling is a problem, we don't have to look too hard at public schooling. We can say that's better, that's safe. So in some ways, as my friend Nadia Williams has said at Front Porch Republic, homeschooling is a red herring for what's really going on in public schools.
It's two things have come to mind. On Facebook, the other social media platform this morning, I was reading some comments. Someone had posted a story from Vanity Fair, and the headline said, RFK Jr. is now going after your antidepressants. Mm-hmm. And the actual story was that during some interview, he suggested SSRIs need more research to kind of examine their possible negative side effects. Now,
Yes.
in the comment section, people were hysterical. Some woman is saying, the government is going to take away my husband's SSRIs, who was in an accident, whose brain is damaged and can't process serotonin, and he depends on these things. And I think a lot of times, well, what I concluded, and I think this is relevant to the question of homeschooling, is that we really have now a not negligible percentage of our population driven so mad with fear by kind of alarmist headlines and an inability to read beyond them, that really what has happened is that a big part of our population is just terrified of anyone on either side who suggests moving away from the neoliberal narrative that dominates our culture in any way. Mm-hmm. And that this person doesn't really, this person doesn't really believe that the government's going to ban SSRIs and keep her brain damaged husband from having the medicine he needs. But that any suggestion that there's any way to do anything outside of this very narrow, sort of narrow cultural approach, which involves, lots of medication and lots of public schooling, just sets people's alarm bells off in ways that are, inexplicable almost, outside of, I suppose, the explanation that they're just highly anxious people driven to the precipice of sanity by alarmist kinds of headlines. And I think you see that a lot when people want to criticize homeschooling.
Well, I think you're right that we live in an alarm-based media culture and marketing culture and political culture. And fear sells, and it's a high motivator. Mm-hmm. You feel fear and you feel a whoosh of energy because your body is telling you got to do something about this right now. So it's a call to action. So people want you to do something. Fear is the quickest way to mobilize you. With homeschooling, I think you're right in the sense that it's an alternative. And for a long time, it was counterculture. I think that since the pandemic, it is quite a bit less countercultural in the sense that it stopped being just odd people who did it. Mm. I mean odd people in the best way. But during the pandemic, people who were not countercultural in other ways began homeschooling. Mm-hmm. And after a few months of everyone on social media saying how amazing homeschoolers are and how they suddenly understand how hard it is and all of that, the media started putting out alarmist articles about homeschooling. And that was very curious. And I think, if we allow alternatives, then that means that what we ourselves have chosen might not be safe. So if the only thing you can do is send your child to a public school, you don't really have to consider whether that's good for your child or good for the country. And sometimes it is good for your child to do. But if someone else is homeschooling, you start to feel this internal pressure that maybe what you're doing is not good enough. And I think that's one of the reasons that people also sometimes jump on folks like me or like any number of other people who are trying to use research to speak moderately and accurately about the homeschool movement because they don't want to hear that. They want to hear that homeschooling isn't safe because then they don't have to challenge what they're doing. So no matter how moderate you are or how research-based you are in what you're saying, they will hear something else. So kind of like that article you were talking about, she heard the headline. She probably didn't even read the article. Right. But the headline was designed to get her upset so that she'd, engage. But yeah, so you would think in public discourse that careful thought and generous speech would be the most effective way of communicating, but it's not the most, it doesn't have the biggest impact.
It's interesting that you talk about people who see homeschooling as unsafe, because this is part of the larger point I'm making, is that we have such a large part of our population whose number one value is safety, and whose number one understanding of how to be safe is through a kind of strict adherence to this sort of neoliberal life script that's been provided to everyone. And that means all sorts of things, including jumping to the conclusion that the government's going to take away your husband's antidepressant, and certainly going to public school. Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and I would extend that a little bit, because I don't think it's just neoliberalism or I think it's true that people on the far left dominate much of our conversation, and they really, but I think of some conservative subcultures that embrace the same kind of rule following, often in a way that really restricts human dignity and freedom out of a desire to be safe. That if I tick the right boxes, I will be safe.
Sure.
And the reality is, in terms of tragedy or things going really terribly wrong, we do not have a lot of control over that sort of thing. Your child can get cancer, and you can't do a darn thing about that. Sure. And you can feed him right and get him fresh air, and he can still get cancer. And, we really struggle with that because we do not know how to handle suffering. So sometimes your child gets cancer, and people so much want to believe that they can avoid their kid getting cancer that they will blame you. They want to know something you did. What is different about you, So with these other things, when there's something that is distinctive, that threatens that list that people have, that I tick these boxes. And you'll see it, just speaking of social media, you'll see it on places like Twitter, where people want to make really strong statements. And of course, those are the statements that get engagement. So that's part of it. Part of it is just getting clicks. But part of that is it's a safety behavior. It's a safety behavior. Yeah.
Right. And when I say neoliberal, I don't necessarily mean just like a kind of political agenda, but rather an understanding of human life that's basically conditioned around a sort of soft leftist understanding of human relationships, and an understanding of the purpose of human life, which is fundamentally shaped by your participation in a free market economy.
Right.
So that means something a little more than just like people who hold leftist beliefs. Right. And it's when I was a university professor, I'd see this a lot when parents would come into my office with their disheveled, uninterested teenage son and say, "But what could he do with this degree?" And what they're really asking is, will he be able to study this and still buy a bunch of stuff? And that this is, in my mind, the quintessential sort of nature of our cultural life script, is put aside all of his passion, which he has already clearly done, because that's why he's come to my office in sweatpants and is essentially sliding up, right? Because he has no passion for anything. And what really matters, and what my job as a professor was to reassure parents that, yes, he could come here and study in our department and still have a superior level of purchasing power. Right.
Yeah.
And so this is the point of the sort of educational life script is public school or maybe private school up to university, a big university, studying something that has whose purpose is to guarantee you purchasing power in the global economy. And when that sort of becomes the telos of education, well, then homeschooling is definitely threatening it because you're offering an entirely different anthropology and an entirely different telos for what education is all about.
It's a really different perspective on education, and there's so much diversity within it, within homeschooling, and it looks very different from family to family sometimes. But I do feel that I, both as a homeschooling parent and as a researcher, as a professor, I haven't taught in a couple of years either, but the college where I taught, I feel like I live in an alternative educational landscape. And when you are functioning in a landscape that values the liberal arts as something that is about formation of the person, and that it is appropriate for human beings to study these things because they are human beings, because they add beauty to life, because they form the soul, because they form the mind. Okay, so it sounds a little frou-frou because, yes, people do need to get a job, right? But no matter what your job is, you need to have some sense of what life is for. And I think that when people do choose to homeschool, and certainly there are parents who use normative schools who are this way also, but when you homeschool, you come into a kind of contact with your children that you don't have if you're sending them away to school. Just the number of hours you spend with those kids. And often you'll see homeschooling parents change a lot over the first few years because they often start out with an idea that they're going to do something like the school that they went to, but they're going to do it at home. And then they start to learn about how their children work, and it starts to unfold. And I know that for me, observing my children has been a tremendous gift to really observe what they're learning and what they need, and to be able to respond to that instinctively and in a fluid way. That's really been amazing. And good teachers have always done that in schools, but it is excruciatingly difficult to find a classroom that allows a teacher to do that now, because classroom policies are so controlled from on high.
It's interesting. I just recorded an interview with a Twitter user named James Fury who writes a lot, who's a classroom teacher, and we discussed some of this. But I also think back about a conversation I had many years ago now with a couple of my former high school teachers, and I said to them, well, I would assume now that that kind of the schools are less highly pressured with regard to just conforming, and there are probably fewer rules now than there were when I was there. And they both said, "Oh no, it's worse."
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think back to my high school education. Now I hated high school and hated being in public schools, but looking back, I can see that I really got a remarkable education in the humanities to the certain degree that my high school could provide it. And I think about the pieces of literature I studied in high school that I still know. I remember in high school, so we studied To His Coy Mistress, and I think that's Andrew Marvell. I may have that wrong, but it came up somewhere the other day, and I recognized it from Mrs. Reedy's 10th grade English class, where she also made us memorize a passage and recite a passage from Julius Caesar, because Mrs. Reedy was a serious person. And I don't think that sort of thing happens at all now. I speak to young people, I speak to students who have no conversance at all with any kind of literary canon.
Mm-hmm.
I speak to Christian students who could not tell me the story of Lot,
Mm-hmm.
who totally are divorced from simply the content of the Bible. And so I think, what is happening in schools?
Part of it is that they can't read.
Mm-hmm.
They can read, but they cannot read comfortably. They cannot read fluidly and fluently. So the idea of reading by choice, it's uncomfortable. That's what I think for them. And
But
then if they're
why?
not reading in school, why?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there are a number of reasons. I mean, I think one is the just radical, just overwhelming takeover of education by tech.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I was in high school, I graduated in 2001 from a public high school in California, and our school had been designated like a technology leader school or something. And so the big thing was that we had to use PowerPoint in a presentation in every class. You know, PowerPoint at that time. I mean, this was not a lot. But when schools are offered technology, they take it. And it's often offered for free or for a discount.
Mm-hmm.
So in my own school district here in Virginia, starting in second grade, each child is issued I think it's an iPad, some sort of device, and they do all their work on it. That's what they do their work on. So they're not even manually writing. Now I have a second grader. I have a 7-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And that child, like so many healthy 7-year-old boys, is bouncing off the walls. You know, he's running around. I'm having him fill the wood box to do some heavy work. And, he's digging and he's reading, sitting upside down on the couch. And homeschooling allows that. But in the school, they have to sit in a desk and look at a screen.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they don't develop facility with their fine motor skills, even their large motor skills. I think they don't develop reading facility because they don't have to read.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Common Core and literature classes, they don't read literature, at least not entire works of literature. And as you were speaking about the impact that some of the books you read in high school had on you, I was thinking that there are many, many children who do not come across things like that unless they encounter them in school.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you come from an intellectual family, you're going to be reading whether or not you're reading at school. But, you were talking about great works of literature, Julius Caesar. I'll do you one better. I don't think kids know nursery rhymes.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know the Grimm's fairy tales. So those morality tales, Aesop's fables, that our culture's morality is partly based on, the current generations are not going to be able to refer to those. So they don't have a common literary and cultural foundation. And I would say, as a historian, I think it's also true that they are ignorant of history and everything is in the now. Mm-hmm. So in terms of being able to have that kind of decent, moderate, respectful conversation of disagreement and having that be effective, that only works if there's some sort of common ground. Mm-hmm. Even in war, we have the rules of war,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But I think that the change in curriculum and in teaching style and in materials has really taken that, ironically, it's taken that common core away.
It's interesting. I also recall another story when I was in junior high. I was in 8th grade, I think, maybe 9th grade. And my English teacher, Mrs. Meyer, noticed that I was not happy and that I didn't like this. And one day after class, she called me up and she said, "I think you should take this and read it." And she gave me a little book. And the little book was On Civil Disobedience by Henry David
Wow.
I went and read Thoreau on civil disobedience. And years later, I bumped into Mrs. Meyer and I reminded her that she had done that. And I said, and you have gotten me into so much trouble over these, right? But I don't think that would ever happen now. Like a student, a teacher would notice a student and think, well, I can think of this work of American literature that might really help this student understand himself in a way.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. And I mean, it might happen, but it's not going to happen with the same kind of frequency. And I think that, the teachers who taught me, I'm right at the end of a generation. So when I went through school, things were changing right behind me, a year or two behind me. So, for example, when I was in college, we didn't have cell phones. I mean, they existed, but when I was a senior, all the freshmen had them. So everything was right behind me. And one of the things that happened was that my teachers quit in the year or two after my class. Many, many of my experienced, wonderful teachers. And one of them, my literature teacher from high school, I've remained good friends with. And when the Common Core restricted her curriculum so that she could not teach complete novels, she told me she went into the principal's office and she said to him, I'm going to buy 35 copies of 1984 and we are going to read them. And she walked out. And he let her, but a couple years later, she retired. It was just too much. So that kind of teacher, I know there are still good and loving teachers, but you can't do that. You can't choose what you teach.
I'll tell you one more story. In college, I had a professor who became pretty well known in his field. And part of it reason is that he was such a good teacher. And he would come in he came in on the first day and he said, in education, we often hear that good teachers teach students, not their discipline. And I am here to say, I teach history. And of course, he was a wonderful teacher, right? But he was wonderful because he was willing to sort of shirk the fad. And it's one of those, and when I think back about that class, which was American intellectual history, I think I could have gotten so much more out of that if I had paid closer attention. But maybe that's the sign that you had a really good educational experience as a young person, is when you think back, boy, if I had only paid attention to what Dr. Rabel said about Thorstein Veblen, I'd probably be better off,
Well, that's what I was just thinking, is that it sounds to me like he actually did teach through relationship. He was just saying he's not going to leave the history out, and that in some ways he flagged something to you that was important. And I think there's certainly no one way to educate or to teach, but I think I am personally flabbergasted that most Americans are so ignorant of what the public schools are failing at. I mean, it used to be 20 years ago to homeschool, you had to, or 30 years ago, you had to object to not you had to, but many people objected to the teaching of evolution, or they were very, very morally conservative and they didn't want their children exposed to other kinds of kids, or, things like that. Today, none of that. You don't have to have any of that. Certainly people do have moral and religious concerns, but academics are enough. I mean, the fact that the academic education is on average not at proficiency level, I think is it makes it difficult for me to accept that it's appropriate to put more than the most basic requirements upon homeschooling. Because if state boards of education are going to say what quality homeschooling is, they need first to be able to say what quality schooling is.
Mm-hmm.
And if they can't do it in their public schools, other people should have their chance.
Right.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the history of homeschooling? Anything?
Well, I have written a book. I do have a book coming out from Erdman's. It's called Skipping School, Finding the Roots of Modern Homeschooling in the American Past.
Mm.
So the history of homeschooling is very interesting because I mentioned a little while ago that it's often been a countercultural practice. And sometimes you'll hear people say things about how George Washington was homeschooled or Abraham Lincoln was homeschooled. And in a sense, that is true.
Yes.
They did their studies at home for at least part of their education. Lincoln was self-taught for much of that. But at the time, that was not countercultural. That was a normal way of learning. So they weren't doing anything against a norm.
Mm-hmm.
Now, by the time we got into the 20th century, that norm had dramatically waned. So the story of the 20th century is sort of a march towards school consolidation, formalization, and curricula and other policy choices coming down from on high.
Why did people think that was a good idea? So
to consolidate and,
yes. So, for example, around the corner from where my parents live, there's a country road and a little plaque outside that says, "This is where the Millville School used to be."
Mm-hmm.
And at some point in the, maybe you can tell me when, but somebody decided it would be better to get rid of all these. Why should Millville have its own school? And when everyone can just go to the county school?
Mm-hmm.
And we can, how did that come about?
Well, originally America had public schools extremely early in the 17th century. Now, most of the time, these were organized by parents. So in some of the territories in the 19th century, as people were moving west, there were laws that when you chartered a town, when you established a town, you had to set aside a lot for a church and you had to set aside a lot for a school. So it was considered politically important. But parents organized these schools. They chose and hired the teachers. They boarded the teachers. They were on the school board. Over the course of the 19th century, urbanization made this nearly impossible in cities. Because in New York City, by the 1880s, you had classrooms of 50 children speaking 6 different languages. I mean, it was a disaster. It was a mess, right? And the first progressive educators in the 1890s began to notice that these children weren't learning anything. So they could recite things, but they could not. So, for example, in one famous example, they could recite a letter, but they could not compose a letter. They could tell you how to spell a word, but they couldn't write a sentence with it. So the progressive response to that, and this is part of the larger progressive era in the early 20th century that included welfare and restricting child labor, et cetera, and fixing social ills became the business of the government rather than just private citizens and churches. When that happened, the progressives tried to have small local schools again that were really connected to the community. But they wanted to change what was being taught there from an agricultural point of view, from a manual labor, like kind of shop class point of view. And over time, what that morphed into was a professionalization of teaching, where parents stopped being the ones that had the largest influence over the school, and it became professional educators. So this is a very quick and dirty sort of narrative, but progressive education changed from something that was very child-focused and trying to be very local to the degree that they wanted teachers to write their own curricula for each particular class. To you send your child to school and we will make of your child what we need for the economy. And So over the course of the 30s, high school enrollment went up dramatically because of the Great Depression, because teenagers could not get jobs. So they were put in school where they could receive lunch and where they wouldn't get into trouble.
Mhm.
And then in the 40s, schools were and 50s, schools were consolidated so that we could win the space race.
Let
Because,
me just,
sorry, I
so we
could go
can win
on.
the space race, you were saying.
Yeah. Hmm.
But let me just point out, like, what, given what I was saying earlier about how people have become so attached to the sort of prescribed life script that they become alarmed by anything that suggests it could change. When in reality, the things that they're attached to, like thoroughgoing public schooling as we know it, is in fact extremely recent development.
Yes. And that is the ahistoricism, because people aren't learning any history. So you will hear conservatives hearken back to the 1950s. And certainly there were good things about the 1950s. But most American historians will tell you that the 1950s were an aberration. They were a very strange decade. So, for example, I myself have for many years been primarily a homemaker. I do more professional work now, and I certainly support having a mother at home to care for the children in the home full time when that is the decision of the family. It can be a very, very good thing. And it's an old model in some ways, but people hearken back to this in the 1950s as if this is how human history has always been. And in reality, for most of our history in this country, at least, and in the Western world for many centuries, there was a domestic economy that involved both parents and all the children working together. And there were distinctions between types of labor, but they're not the distinctions people think they were. So, for example, on a farm in the 19th century, if you think about like the Little House on the Prairie books,
Mm.
a boy at the age of 7 would be almost entirely under the tutelage of his father. The
Sure.
father was educating and caring for that child all day long, not the mother, because so this idea that's a sort of ahistorical idea. So like that with schools, people hearken back to the 1950s as if this was the perfect time for school, but there's a narrative here. There's not stasis.
Mm.
You know?
Mm. Yes. Okay. So public schools were kind of becoming entrenched in the form that we know them in the 50s.
Yes. And the Catholic schools, which were the big alternate, I mean, the biggest system at that time, had their highest enrollment. It was 50% of Catholic
Mm.
children. And then that began to wane. So all those children funneled into the public schools beginning in the 1960s. And the economy changed so that fewer women were staying home, and childcare became more important as an aspect of school. And then, a big part of this narrative is the racism that was inherent in the segregationist school system, which is 100% real. And when schools are entirely locally controlled, they can be controlled to segregate and to disadvantage certain kids. So busing and consolidating schools was a solution to that, which did not work. But
Mm.
that is probably the biggest factor in why those small schools, like the one you mentioned, I mean, I don't know if that
Uh-huh.
particular one, but
Right.
the neighborhood school, where there was a neighborhood with a little elementary school in it and everyone went there, was deliberately changed so that the children who went there were not just from that neighborhood, to increase diversity. And that's why when I grew up, on one side of my street you went to Ramona High School, and on one side of my street you went to Poly High School. And even though the Ramona side of the street was actually closer to the Poly side of the street, to Poly High School, you couldn't go there. you
Mm.
know and again, like I said, it didn't really work in terms of successfully integrating. But that's a big part of the story. And as I look back on that, just personally as an educator and as a historian, I don't know what the solution is that allows for neighborhood schools and you know corrects the ills of segregation. but we don't have it. We don't have the solution right now.
So how does this bring us to the history of homeschooling?
Well, when parents started to cease having influence over education, when I was a kid, my mom knew some of the teachers, and so did my dad. My dad was a professor of education, and he had actually taught some of my teachers. Now, this is in the late 80s, right? So later. But when my youngest brothers, who were about 20 years younger than me, went to that same school, my father was not allowed on the campus. Parents were only allowed in the office. You could not go to the classroom. It was all locked. You couldn't go in there. That's the kind of change that makes parents say, what is happening in there that I'm not allowed to see it?
That all happened after Columbine.
Yes. But even before that, I think when I interviewed homeschoolers for my book from the 1980s and 90s, and then looking back at some of the court cases and other documents that we have about homeschoolers in the 50s and 60s and 70s, a lot of them felt that they did not have adequate influence in the classroom. So there was some concern about what was being taught or how it was being taught. Or what often happened and still happens is a child was being bullied and the school didn't address it. Or a child had a learning disability and the school would not respond properly. Something like that would happen. And so parents would decide that they were going to try it at home. And at first it was very few parents and it was not necessarily legal. But by the time it had grown, by the 1990s, and then especially after 2000, it became something that was resourced. So there wasn't money for it, but there were lots of curriculum providers and other people you could talk to. It wasn't as hidden anymore. So the story of homeschooling since 1950 is one where it began, I think, it was begun by people who still held on to this idea that schooling should be influenced by parents. So that older idea. And that gained momentum as the schools became less and less responsive to parents and children. And in the pandemic, when homeschooling jumped to 11% of families in one summer of 2020, a lot of that was driven by parents seeing Zoom schooling, realizing it was ineffective and that it was very, very bad for their 6-year-old to be staring at a video stream for 7 hours a day, and thinking, even if it's just for this year, surely I can do better than this. Isn't it better if he runs around outside even? What if he doesn't learn to read? Who cares? At least he won't be staring at this screen. So I think that it came into people's awareness. And my argument in the book is that this longer thread of believing in parental influence in education is still part of the way that we think about education in America, but it sort of has been activated recently by what has been happening in schools, and especially by that realization that parents had during the pandemic.
And I think that is what kicked in. It had sort of been dormant, and now it's kicked in.
It was counterculture. It was like in the subculture. But I think that once parents realized that they did not like what was happening in those public schools, they clicked into it again.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating. When is this book coming out?
We do not have a launch date yet.
Oh.
The manuscript is in editing right now. I'm hoping it will be out at the end of this year. But I will certainly update you on that.
In the meantime, tell us a little bit about Hearth&Field. What is that?
Hearth&Field is a journal of which I am an associate editor. It is a Christian journal of thinking and doing. So it is a journal that tries to very beautifully, to the degree that we can, equip people to think and act in ways that are grounded, are connected to place and to other people and to God. And that ranges from actual tutorials about how to do things that might be of interest to personal essays and deep dives into literature and history, poetry, and beautiful artwork. and lots of recipes. So we're quarterly. We come out 4 times a year, and we also are online monthly.
You sent me, I guess, the most recent issue. I was surprised that it's essentially a book.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
much more like a book than a magazine.
yeah, it's about 200 pages, and all the issues are. And the idea is we don't want to contribute to the ephemeral throwaway culture. And if you go to our website, hearthandfield.com, I hope what you'll find when you look at it is that it feels a bit different from other websites. There's not a lot of flash, there's not a lot of clickbait, and a number of readers have told me that it actually makes it feel very comfortable to read a long form essay in a way that it doesn't on other sites. And so with our print edition, we want it to be something that people can keep. So they're sort of roughly seasonal, fall, spring, winter, but there's a lot of content in each issue that is not seasonally themed. And we've got writers from all sorts of Christian backgrounds. Most of the editors, I believe, are Roman Catholic, but like I said, we have lots of different writers, and we want to help push back against the fleeting present tech flashing light kind of way of living, and try to help people feel a little more like they're in reality.
What's the history of this magazine? How did it come about?
It was brought into being online a few years ago by our editor-in-chief, Matthew Giambrone, who's out of Wisconsin. And Matt had worked in the tech industry for quite some time. And so although he values technology in its place, as I hope we all do, was aware of some of the weaknesses and harms that it also was causing. And he really wanted to try to create something different. And so he began the website, and I came on board maybe 2.5 years ago, and have really, really enjoyed working there and working with wonderful authors and trying to find different ways. The topical range of the journal is enormous. I don't know if you noticed looking through, but it covers all sorts of things. So hopefully there's something for everyone, men, women, Catholics, non-Catholics, homemakers, career people, and people of different ages. So it's sort of an effort at drawing people into the things you need to build a more peaceful life in community.
And also we were talking earlier about your work at the Front Porch Republic, which what would you say is the significant difference between what FPR does and what Hearth and Field might do?
They're very similar. Like Matt and I both went to the Front Porch Republic conference a couple years ago. I mean, we're sort of, connected or friendly, but we're not, they're two separate.
Sure.
Publications, of course. Front Porch Republic is much older, and I think it is there's a less of an overtly religious tone to it. I don't think that Hearth and Field really is something that is, full of explicit religious expression, but there are references to that. There are at Front Porch Republic too, but I think Front Porch Republic probably draws a wider net in terms of political beliefs, and is more grounded in, that kind of conversation over difference, welcoming all sorts of people to the table, connection to place and to conversation and to other people. So that's what I would say is perhaps the difference. And yeah.
I think I told you I spoke to Jeffrey Bilbro here for this podcast 2 weeks ago, who may, I can't recall.
He's the editor.
Yeah, the I guess the old term is editor-in-chief of Front Porch Republic, and but our conversation, I think, was mostly all literary and not at all political. But one of the things that strikes me when I look at these sorts of publications is the way that the sentiments that are reflected by something like Front Porch Republic or Hearth&Field, they are quite clearly conservative, but not at all the same sort of, well, not the same vibe as you might find on the right wing end of Twitter, which tends to be much more bitter and in a sense extreme. And so I used that term yesterday, and someone made what is a reasonable point, which is to call something extreme is in a way not necessarily dishonest, but at the sort of murky, right? Because, and I've often thought that too, right? To label another person's views as extreme is simply to say, well, my views are moderate, right? Like, well, the extreme is only extreme relative to some center, and I represent the reasonable center. But I do think one of the things we see, certainly on the right and probably on the left, on the online right, is a different kind of extreme where you basically have users who are probably mostly young men who think, how can I represent this position in the least nuanced, most inflammatory way? And so they are in fact seeking an extreme. And so this is a little different than just sort of like the 1990s, mainstream media representation of George Bush Sr. as an extremist. I'm trying to say something different. I'm referring to people who literally are thinking, how can I make my position as inflammatory as possible? What's the difference in the sentiment between those two segments of the right, do you think?
Well, and I should start by clarifying that I contribute to Front Porch Republic, but Jeff is the editor, so he would certainly be much better at explaining the. I think Hearth&Field certainly thinks of itself as small c conservative. We do not think of ourselves as big R Republican.
Sure.
I'm sure many of our contributors and editors are big R Republican, but that is not what we are doing. And certainly Front Porch Republic is not about political affiliations. Wendell Berry is their muse there.
Sure.
And there's always the hope that there will be a lot of different voices. But I mean, you're right. And I think extremes make people feel comforted. Similarly to what we were talking about before is if there is an extreme is a command. If it's an extreme that is presented as correct, it is a command. So some of these really, really icky people on Twitter who are saying things like it's right to choke women or, things that are things that your average, backwoods misogynistic guy in some swamp somewhere wouldn't do, like that would be against his code of manhood.
Right.
Those sort of things are not conservative. Those sort of things are power plays. And when you express an extreme in that way, or it's a political extreme that's expressed, people think, oh, all I have to do is give over my will to this command and I will be safe. And I think that's the attraction for some women to men like that, that particular kind of person, because power attracts and it makes you feel safe. So, yes, there are elements on the right that use extremes and use inflammatory language, sometimes not even intending to follow through. And this is something that the president does sometimes do.
Sure.
For example, and it works, but it is not good for people's souls. It is not good for people. And we have to push back with things like Hearth and Field and things like Front Porch Republic to stop our culture from being completely overrun by people freaking out on Twitter instead of talking to their neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Because whether your neighbor is a Democrat or a Republican, you can still offer to shovel their driveway.
Sure.
I mean, the people you are living with on your block matter, and you should get to know them. And I think we don't do it.
If you will indulge me here, I'll read a tweet that I wrote earlier today, because I think it's part of what's on my mind and why I'm pursuing this line of questioning. I saw a screenshot of a tweet by Laura Loomer. I'm not exactly sure who she is. I know she's some sort of right-wing activist. Mm-hmm. And she wrote, "As a woman, I'd rather die childless than live with the scourge of being a single mom." This is what I'm talking about. But that's just me. I can't imagine a bigger misery than raising a child you will only resent. I would hate myself for the rest of my life if I ever became a single mom. To which I responded, "Every day on this app, I see comments by, quote, conservatives that indicate they have zero conception of real life. They've hardly ever spoken to anyone outside their social media bubble. They have a rigid, mechanical understanding of life where good people make good choices and experience good consequences. If you struggle, it's your fault. You must have chosen badly somewhere. It is a view of life so simplistic as to be totally wrong. Conservatives, in quotes, with no realistic view of life, with indeed an anti-human view of life, are useless, no good to anyone, unable to help, to pitch in, to offer solace or wisdom, might as well be on the far left. More and more it becomes clear that what matters most is a level of practical wisdom for living that is slowly disappearing because it doesn't draw a big audience online." Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that the thing that's trying to happen with Hearth and Field, and probably with Front Porch Republic, is that those publications are sort of dedicated to cultivating a connection with reality in a way that right-wing Twitter is not.
I think that's well said. And I would ask, of that person, and I did see that tweet, what exactly is she conserving?
Right.
They aren't conservatives. That's not conservative. That's not conserving anything except your ability to watch Netflix whenever you want because there's no kid in the room.
Right.
What small c conservatives, I would hope, or at least, at Hearth and Field, want to conserve is an understanding of human beings as inherently valuable, worth the space they take up, worth the burdens they create. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that I personally know any parents who actually regret having their children. I mean, that tweet comes from a place of probably trying to get clicks more than actually even meaning what she said. I have no idea.
Right.
But even bad parents, like to some degree, love and enjoy their children. And I think it goes back to what I was saying about your neighbors, and that if you're thinking of people in categories online, you won't have the chance to discover that a neighbor who's different from you can be kind to your children. Right. You're like, oh, this is a universal truth. People love their children. Maybe they don't all treat their children well, but that is human nature. Mm. And children are a good. So that tweet, it speaks to so many things which you outlined so well in your response. And fundamentally, like you're saying about reality, it speaks to a complete misunderstanding of who human beings are and what they are for. We are not here to protect ourselves from everything. We are here to live. Mm. And living means living with people.
And it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, too, about how no matter what you do, your child could still get cancer. That a lot of these so-called online conservatives don't seem to have a grasp of the nature of reality in which bad things they're like conservatives with no sense of the tragic. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So one of the great things about doing this podcast is I talk to a lot of like really thoughtful and smart people. And a few weeks ago, I talked to Dr. Cooper, who is an expert in Arthuriana, who helped me to understand that if Arthur had, instead of turning his blind eye to Guinevere's affair with Lancelot, which brought down Camelot, if he had punished Lancelot, he would have lost his best knight and Camelot would have fallen. And that this is a truth about human life that many so-called conservatives online conservatives simply haven't accepted, is that there are many times in life where you are doomed because you don't have a good option. Just like
yeah. I mean, I would prefer not to use the word doomed myself, but I understand what you're saying. I think legalism and extreme views, they come from this idea that you can protect yourself from suffering. And we can no more protect ourselves from suffering than we can ensure ourselves joy. You know, there are things we can do to affect these things, of course, but, you know, I experienced a personal tragedy when I was 13. My mother died suddenly in her sleep. And there were a number of sort of domino effects that happened from that in the following years. And because of that experience of all of a sudden something going catastrophically wrong, I have to live my life pushing back against the idea that safety is the most important thing. Because all a child wants to do when her mother dies is prevent it from happening again with another person, you know?
Sure.
And so now as a mother myself, you know, I can't protect my children to the degree I would like to. And so parents have a choice. They can try to protect their children to the degree they would like to, or they can try to live in prudence rather than in fear. And those are two very different things.
Yes. I was going to say, I mean, perhaps part of the difference between a kind of conservatism that might be represented by something like Hearth&Field versus, you know, online conservative influencers or whatever, is that there's a certain kind of conservatism that recognizes human limitation and frailty, and in response urges a kind of living according to practical wisdom, which we have typically called tradition, and a sort of flattened conservatism whose real purpose is just to trigger the libs.
And it's sort of a cherry picking conservatism because they don't actually know anything about the past. So, you know, like you'll see this sometimes in religious practice where people will pick up on some practice and it's going to be different in different traditions, of course, but like it's becoming increasingly common for conservative Catholic women to wear a veil at church, which is totally fine and was the practice for a very long time. But pulling the veil from the past doesn't make you a traditional faithful Catholic, right?
Right.
And there's a temptation to pull things from the past and apply them as if they will make you safe, as if they're talismans. It's almost superstitious, rather than looking back and thinking about the whole thing. So when you were speaking of traditions and those things which we do wish to conserve, I was thinking about how communities support one another through traditions. And when we lose traditions like, how do we care for a mother after she has a baby? How do we help someone when they're grieving? How do we bury the dead? How do we educate our children? You know, how do men and women interact? You know, what are the safeguards that are in place so that men and women can interact, you know, safely and in warm ways and help each other? You know, when those things go, people are left so adrift, and it makes them want to grab on to these solutions. You know, because you think to yourself, if I'm not getting what I need maybe it's because I have not yet accepted what this guy says will solve it. So, for example, if you don't have a strong local community and you find yourself in need and you're not getting support, you start to think, what can I do? And it's, oh, I'm not right. It's something I haven't done. Whereas in reality, it's because the community is so fragmented that nobody knows how to help or nobody knows you're suffering. So I agree with you. Those traditions are really important, and they also put you on autopilot so that you don't have to agonize over every little thing. You just know that if there's a funeral, you're going to go,
Sure.
or whatever it is. And that's that practical wisdom that, yeah, I hope we are trying to extend in Hearth&Field to the degree that we or our writers even have it, and to talk about it and figure out solutions.
Well, we've been gone for over an hour now, so maybe it's time to wrap up. But tell people where they can find you online and where they can find Hearth&Field and that kind of thing.
Sure. Well, I am online at a number of places, but my main website is my Substack, which is thehollow.substack.com. You can read all my writing there for various publications, and you can read about my book. And for Hearth&Field, it's just hearthandfield.com. Really encourage you to go check it out. You can sign up for free. You only get 1 or 2 emails a month. And you can also sign up for our print subscription, which is very much worth your while if you would like to hold something in your hands and read it over a season and figure out ways to enrich your life.
All right. Thank you very much. I said, thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry. You froze. The video froze for a moment. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, I feel like we've only scratched the surface, so maybe we'll have to do it again sometime.
Sure. Sounds great. Maybe when the book is coming out.
Yeah, great. Let me know.
I will.